Billionaire ignored his pregnant wife for months, until their baby was born and she faced complications. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from, and once the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Oh, and make sure to follow our channel for more stories like this. Now, sit back and enjoy every detail. The penthouse office on the 42nd floor of Vane Aerospace headquarters gleamed with cold perfection. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the Seattle skyline, while expensive art adorned walls that had witnessed countless million-dollar deals. Behind the mahogany desk sat Sullivan Vane, 37 years old, his steel-gray eyes scanning quarterly reports with the precision of a surgeon. Sullivan embodied understated power. Standing 6'3" with broad shoulders that filled his tailored charcoal suit perfectly, he commanded attention without demanding it. His dark brown hair, always perfectly styled, never showed a strand out of place. His jawline could have been carved from marble, and his hands, strong, capable hands that had signed billion-dollar contracts, moved with deliberate efficiency across the documents. But those who looked closely might notice the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly when reviewing the aerospace division's family-oriented marketing campaigns. Sullivan Vane had built an empire, but empires required sacrifices. The intercom buzzed softly. "Mr. Vane, your wife called. She wanted to remind you about dinner at 7. Sullivan's fingers paused above his platinum pen. Aurora. Even her name softened something in his expression that no board member had ever seen. "Thank you, Margaret. Cancel my 8 o'clock. "Of course, sir." Aurora Vane, formerly Aurora Winters, was everything Sullivan had never expected to find in his carefully controlled world. At 32, she possessed a natural beauty that didn't require the artifice so common in his social circles. Her auburn hair fell in gentle waves past her shoulders, framing a heart-shaped face with warm hazel eyes that sparkled with genuine mirth. She was petite at 5'5", but her presence filled any room she entered. Unlike the polished socialites who orbited his world, Aurora worked as a pediatric nurse at Seattle Children's Hospital. Her hands, soft but capable, had comforted countless frightened children. She wore minimal makeup, preferring the flush of genuine emotion to cosmetic enhancement. When she smiled, which she did often, it transformed her entire face, creating tiny lines around her eyes that spoke of a life filled with authentic joy. Their marriage had been the surprise of Seattle's elite social scene, the billionaire aerospace mogul and the nurse who drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic. But what others saw as an unlikely pairing, Sullivan knew as inevitable. Aurora had walked into his life during a charity gala she'd attended as a friend's +1, wearing a simple black dress that cost less than his watch, and somehow made every other woman in the room fade into irrelevance. She hadn't known who he was, hadn't cared about his net worth or his influence. She'd simply looked at him with those honest eyes and asked if he was enjoying the evening, because he looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He'd fallen in love with her authenticity, her warmth, her ability to find wonder in small moments. Aurora laughed at movies, cried during commercials, and believed fundamentally in the goodness of people. She was light where he was shadow, hope where he carried history's weight. At 7:15, Sullivan walked through the front door of their Queen Anne home, a restored Victorian that Aurora had fallen in love with during their house hunt. She'd ignored the modern mansions his realtor had shown them, instead gravitating toward this house with its original hardwood floors, stone fireplace, and wraparound porch that she claimed was perfect for morning coffee. "You're late," Aurora called from the kitchen, but her voice held affection, not accusation. Sullivan found her stirring something fragrant on the stove, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing jeans and one of his old college t-shirts that had somehow migrated into her wardrobe. She'd kicked off her sneakers, and her bare feet moved silently across the kitchen tiles as she prepared their dinner. "Emergency board call," he said, approaching her from behind and wrapping his arms around her waist. "Forgive me." She leaned back against his chest and he felt some of the day's tension dissolve. "Always," she murmured. "How was your day?" "Better now." And he meant it. In Aurora's presence, the weight of expectations, the pressure of maintaining his empire, the echoes of his father's voice, all of it receded to manageable levels. They ate dinner by candlelight, Aurora sharing stories from the hospital while Sullivan listened, occasionally offering insights but mostly content to watch her animated expressions. She talked with her hands, gestured wildly when excited, and had a habit of tilting her head when she was thinking deeply about something. After dinner, they settled on the couch, Aurora curled against his side while he absently stroked her hair. The evening felt perfect, suspended in the kind of contentment Sullivan had never believed possible for someone like him. "Sullivan," Aurora said softly, her voice carrying a note he couldn't quite identify. "I need to tell you something." He felt her body tense slightly against his, and his own muscles responded in kind. In his experience, conversations that began this way rarely ended well. "What is it?" Aurora pulled back to look at him, her hazel eyes bright with an emotion he couldn't read. She took a deep breath, reached for his hands, and held them in both of hers. "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Sullivan felt the world tilt, his carefully constructed reality shifting on its axis. His hands, still held in Aurora's smaller ones, went completely still. Pregnant. A baby. His baby. Images flashed through his mind unbidden. His father's cold voice. Funeral flowers. A gravestone he'd visited once and never again. The price of love. The cost of life. Aurora was watching his face, her expression transforming slowly from hopeful anticipation to confusion, then to something that looked dangerously close to hurt. "Sullivan, say something." But he couldn't, because the only thing echoing in his mind was his father's voice from 37 years ago. "Your existence cost the life of the only woman I ever loved." What if he was destined to repeat that pattern? What if loving Aurora, wanting this life with her, would ultimately destroy the very thing he was trying to protect? The silence stretched between them, heavy and terrible, until Aurora's eyes filled with tears she was too proud to let fall. Had Aurora just given him the greatest gift imaginable? Or had she unknowingly pronounced her own death sentence? 3 weeks had passed since Aurora's announcement, and the Victorian house that had once felt like a sanctuary now echoed with unspoken words and careful distances. Sullivan had mastered the art of being present while remaining completely absent, a skill that served him well in hostile boardroom negotiations, but was slowly poisoning his marriage. Aurora stood in front of the bathroom mirror, her hand resting on her still flat stomach as she examined her reflection. At 8 weeks pregnant, her body hadn't begun to show the changes happening within, but she could feel them. The subtle tenderness in her breasts, the way certain smells now made her queasy, the bone-deep fatigue that no amount of sleep seemed to cure. She'd scheduled her first prenatal appointment for today, alone. The sound of Sullivan's shower running in the master bathroom reminded her of how even their most intimate spaces had become territories to navigate around each other. He rose earlier now, showered while she was still in bed, and left for work before she could suggest they grab coffee together. Their dinner conversations, once flowing and natural, had devolved into polite inquiries about each other's days, surface-level exchanges between two people learning to be strangers. "Aurora, you okay in there?" Sullivan's voice came through the bathroom door, carrying what might have been genuine concern if she didn't know better. "Fine," she called back, her voice steadier than she felt. "Just getting ready for work." She heard his footsteps pause outside the door, as if he might say something more. The silence stretched until his footsteps retreated toward their walk-in closet. Aurora closed her eyes, fighting back tears that seemed to come more easily these days. She'd read that emotional sensitivity was common during early pregnancy, but she suspected her current fragility had less to do with hormones and more to do with the growing chasm between her and the man she'd married. When she emerged from the bathroom, Sullivan was adjusting his tie in front of the full-length mirror. He wore a navy blue suit today, one that complemented his eyes and made his shoulders appear even broader. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his jaw clean-shaven, every inch the successful businessman who graced the covers of financial magazines. He looked up when she entered, their eyes meeting in the mirror's reflection. For a moment, Aurora saw something flicker across his features, longing, perhaps, or regret, but it vanished so quickly she might have imagined it. "I'll be late tonight," he said, turning to face her directly. "Board meeting runs until at least 9. Aurora nodded, pulling a soft cardigan over her scrubs. "I have an appointment this afternoon anyway." "Appointment?" His voice sharpened slightly, and she saw his hands still on his cufflinks. "Prenatal appointment. First ultrasound." She kept her tone casual, as if discussing a dentist visit, rather than their first glimpse of their unborn child. Sullivan's face went carefully blank, an expression she'd learned to recognize and hate over the past few weeks. It was the same look he wore during difficult business negotiations when he needed to hide his thoughts behind an impenetrable mask. Right, of course. He reached for his briefcase, the movement decisive and final. Drive safely. That was it. No offer to reschedule his meeting. No suggestion that they go together. No curiosity about seeing their baby's first photograph. Just a polite dismissal that felt like a physical blow. Aurora watched him leave, heard his car start in the driveway, and only then allowed herself to sink onto their bed and cry. At Seattle Children's Hospital, Aurora moved through her shift with practiced efficiency, but her colleagues noticed the change in her usual bright demeanor. During her lunch break, she sat in the hospital cafeteria, pushing a sandwich around her plate while staring at the information packet from her obstetrician's office. "You look like someone stole your lunch money," came a familiar voice. Aurora looked up to see Dr. Meredith Foster sliding into the seat across from her. Meredith was Aurora's closest friend at the hospital, a pediatric surgeon with sharp wit, unapologetic ambition, and enough emotional intelligence to read people like medical charts. "Just tired," Aurora said, attempting a smile that fooled no one. "Tired is when you need more coffee. This is something else entirely." Meredith leaned back, studying Aurora with the same intensity she brought to diagnosing complex cases. "Want to talk about it?" Aurora hesitated. She and Sullivan had agreed to wait until the end of the first trimester before sharing their news. But the weight of carrying this secret alone, especially when her own husband seemed determined to ignore it, was becoming unbearable. "If I tell you something, can you promise to keep it between us?" "Patient confidentiality extends to friendships too," Meredith said, her expression growing serious. "What's going on?" "I'm pregnant." Meredith's face lit up with genuine joy before she caught Aurora's lack of enthusiasm. "That's wonderful news, isn't it?" "It should be." Aurora's voice cracked slightly. "Sullivan's not handling it well. Actually, that's an understatement. He's pretending it's not happening." "What do you mean?" Aurora found herself pouring out the story. Sullivan's reaction to her announcement, the weeks of careful distance, the way he seemed to physically recoil whenever she tried to bring up anything baby-related. Meredith listened without interruption, her surgeon's training evident in how she absorbed information before offering analysis. "Has he explained why he's reacting this way?" "He won't talk about it. He won't talk about anything real anymore." Aurora wiped her eyes with her napkin. "I feel like I'm married to a stranger. A very polite, very distant stranger who happens to share my bed. Pregnancy can bring up unexpected issues for both partners," Meredith said carefully. "Sometimes fear manifests as withdrawal. Have you considered couples counseling?" Aurora laughed bitterly. "I can't even get him to discuss what we're having for dinner, let alone our deepest fears and feelings. Then maybe it's time to stop letting him set the terms of this conversation." That afternoon, Aurora sat in the dimly lit ultrasound room, her shirt lifted to expose her belly, while the technician applied cold gel to her skin. The wand moved across her abdomen, and suddenly the room filled with a sound that made Aurora's heart skip, a rapid, rhythmic whooshing that could only be one thing. "There's your baby," the technician said, pointing to a small, bean-shaped form on the monitor. "Everything looks perfect. Would you like some pictures?" Aurora stared at the screen through tear-blurred eyes, seeing her child for the first time. The baby was tiny, impossibly small, but undeniably real. She could make out the curve of the head, the beginning of limbs. Her baby, their baby. "Yes, please," she whispered. She drove home with ultrasound photos in her purse and a recording of the heartbeat on her phone, feeling simultaneously elated and heartbroken. This should have been a moment shared with Sullivan. He should have been holding her hand, marveling at the miracle growing inside her, talking about cribs and names and the future they were building together. Instead, she was celebrating alone. Sullivan's car was in the driveway when she arrived home, which surprised her given his claimed late meeting. She found him in his study, still wearing his suit but with his tie loosened, staring out the window with a tumbler of whiskey in his hand. "You're home early," she said from the doorway. He turned and she saw something raw in his expression before he managed to mask it. Meeting ended sooner than expected. Aurora stepped into the room, pulling the ultrasound photos from her purse. "I thought you might want to see these." Sullivan's eyes dropped to the black and white images in her hand, and she watched his face go pale. For a moment, she thought he might reach for them, might ask questions, might show some sign that he cared about the life they'd created together. Instead, he set down his drink and stood up. "I'm going for a run." He left the room, left the house, left her standing there with proof of their miracle in her hands and ice forming in her chest where warmth used to live. As Aurora watched him jog down their tree-lined street through the study window, she realized that somewhere in the past 3 weeks, she'd stopped believing in their love story. The man who'd once made her feel like the center of his universe now treated her like an inconvenience to be managed. She touched her stomach protectively, making a silent promise to the tiny life growing inside her. Even if their father couldn't find the courage to love them, she would love them enough for both parents. But as she placed the ultrasound photos on Sullivan's desk where he couldn't ignore them, Aurora wondered how much rejection one heart could take before it stopped trying to find its way back to love. Sullivan's morning runs had become a ritual of avoidance, each stride carrying him further from the house that had once felt like home, and closer to a past he'd spent decades trying to outrun. The Seattle streets blurred past him as his feet pounded against the pavement in a rhythm that matched his racing heart, not from exertion, but from the constant anxiety that had become his unwelcome companion. 9 weeks pregnant. Aurora was 9 weeks pregnant, and every day that passed without his acknowledgement of that fact felt like another nail in the coffin of their marriage. He knew he was failing her, failing them both, but the alternative, facing his demons head-on, seemed infinitely more terrifying than losing everything he'd built with her. As he rounded the corner toward home, Sullivan's phone buzzed with a text message. He slowed to a jog, then stopped completely when he saw the sender's name. Richard Vane. Board meeting tomorrow, 10 a.m. Don't be late. Dad Sullivan stared at the message, his breathing still heavy from his run, but now for entirely different reasons. His father rarely contacted him directly about business. Their interactions were carefully choreographed through assistants and formal meetings. A personal text could only mean one thing. Richard had heard something he didn't like. The Victorian house came into view, its cheerful yellow exterior and wraparound porch, a stark contrast to the dread settling in Sullivan's chest. Through the kitchen window he could see Aurora moving around, probably preparing breakfast before her shift at the hospital. She wore her hair in a ponytail today, and even from a distance he could see the graceful way she moved, the unconscious elegance that had first caught his attention at that charity gala 3 years ago. He'd been so confident then, so certain that his wealth and status could protect him from the kind of pain his father had warned him about. Aurora had seemed like proof that he could rewrite the Vane family narrative, that love didn't have to end in tragedy. Now, watching her through the window, he felt like a coward. Sullivan entered through the back door, finding Aurora at the stove making scrambled eggs. She glanced up when he walked in, and he caught the brief flash of hope in her eyes, before she masked it with careful neutrality. She'd been doing that more often lately, hoping for connection and then protecting herself when he inevitably disappointed her. "Good run?" she asked, her tone politely conversational. "Fine." He grabbed a water bottle from the refrigerator, hyper-aware of the space between them in their own kitchen. "I'll need to leave early today. Meeting with my father." Aurora's hand stilled on the spatula. In 3 years of marriage, Sullivan could count on one hand the number of times he'd voluntarily met with Richard Vane. Their relationship was professional at best, hostile at worst. "Is everything okay?" "Business," Sullivan said, which wasn't technically a lie but felt like one anyway. Aurora nodded, turning back to the eggs. "I made enough for 2 if you want some." The offer was simple, domestic, the kind of small kindness that had defined their relationship before everything became complicated. Sullivan found himself nodding before his brain could remind him of all the reasons why sitting down to breakfast together was a bad idea. They ate in relative silence, but it wasn't the comfortable quiet they'd once shared. This silence was careful, constructed, full of things neither of them was saying. Aurora picked at her eggs, her usual healthy appetite diminished by morning sickness she hadn't mentioned, but he'd noticed anyway. She'd been pale in the mornings, moving more slowly, reaching for crackers before getting out of bed. He noticed everything about her. That was the problem. "The Hendersons called yesterday," Aurora said eventually, "about dinner this weekend." The Hendersons were their couple friends, Mark and Lisa, married 10 years with twin daughters who Aurora adored. They'd had standing dinner plans once a month until recently, when Sullivan had begun finding excuses to cancel. "I'll be busy this weekend." "You don't even know what weekend I'm talking about." Sullivan looked up from his plate to find Aurora watching him with an expression he couldn't read. There was hurt there, yes, but also something sharper, something that looked like the beginning of anger. "Aurora, do you know what Lisa asked me yesterday?" Aurora continued, her voice steady but gaining strength. "She wanted to know if we were having marriage problems. Apparently you've become the invisible man in our social circle." Sullivan felt heat rise in his chest. Not quite anger, but something close to it. I've been busy with work. You've been busy avoiding me. The words hung between them like an accusation. Sullivan set down his fork, his appetite completely gone, and met his wife's eyes directly for the first time in weeks. That's not. It's exactly what you've been doing. Aurora's voice remained calm, but her hands were trembling slightly. For 9 weeks you've been treating me like a stranger, like someone you're forced to be polite to but would rather not deal with. And I want to know why. Sullivan felt the familiar panic rising in his throat, the same feeling that had consumed him the night Aurora announced her pregnancy. The need to run, to escape, to put distance between himself and the conversation that could destroy everything. I need to shower before my meeting. He stood abruptly, but Aurora's voice stopped him before he could leave the kitchen. I won't do this much longer, Sullivan. He turned back, something in her tone demanding his attention. Do what? Pretend that this is normal. Pretend that it's okay for my husband to act like I don't exist just because I'm carrying his child. Aurora's voice cracked slightly on the last words, but she didn't look away from him. I love you. I've loved you since the night we met, and I thought you loved me too. But this isn't love. This is tolerance. And I deserve better than that. Sullivan felt the world tilt around him. The same vertigo he'd experienced 9 weeks ago when she'd announced her pregnancy. But this time, the fear wasn't just about losing Aurora to childbirth. It was about losing her to his own cowardice. Aurora, I have an appointment with Dr. Martinez next week to talk about our marriage. She stood up, clearing their barely touched breakfast plates. I think you should come with me. I don't need therapy. We need therapy. There's a difference. Sullivan watched her move around their kitchen with determined efficiency, cleaning up their conversation along with their breakfast. He wanted to tell her that he loved her more than his own life. He wanted to explain about his mother, about his father's poison, about the terror that kept him awake at night imagining a world without her in it. Instead, he said nothing. 45 minutes later, Sullivan sat in the reception area outside his father's office on the 50th floor of Vane Aerospace headquarters. The view from here was even more impressive than from his own office, a deliberate reminder of hierarchy that Richard Vane had never been subtle about. He'll see you now, Richard's assistant said, her voice carrying the crisp professionalism that everyone in his father's orbit eventually adopted. Richard Vane sat behind a desk that could have doubled as a small aircraft carrier, his steel-gray hair perfectly styled despite his 73 years. He'd aged well, maintaining the kind of austere elegance that intimidated business rivals and board members alike. But Sullivan saw what others missed, the permanent lines around his father's mouth that spoke of decades of carefully controlled bitterness. You look tired, Richard said without preamble. Hello to you too, Dad. Don't be flippant. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying Sullivan with the same calculating gaze that had made him a legend in the aerospace industry. I had an interesting conversation with Margaret Foster yesterday. Sullivan's blood chilled. Margaret Foster was on the hospital board and a family friend of the Hendersons. If she knew about Aurora's pregnancy, she mentioned that your wife has been seen at the obstetrics clinic. Congratulations seem to be in order. The word congratulations sounded like a curse coming from Richard's lips. Sullivan remained silent, knowing that anything he said would be used against him. You know, Richard continued, his voice taking on the conversational tone that had always preceded his most devastating attacks. I was about your age when I made the same mistake. Marriage isn't a mistake. Marriage is a contract. Having children is a mistake. Richard stood up, moving to the wall of windows that showcased the city below. I loved your mother, Sullivan, more than you'll ever understand. She was brilliant, beautiful, full of life, and having you killed her. Sullivan felt the familiar sick twist in his stomach, the same feeling that had haunted him since childhood. That wasn't my fault, wasn't it? Richard turned back to face him. She could have had a career, could have traveled the world, could have lived a full life. Instead, she chose to have a baby, and that choice cost her everything. She wanted children. She wanted you to be happy. There's a difference. Richard returned to his desk, his expression softening in a way that somehow made his words more cruel. I'm not telling you this to hurt you, son. I'm telling you this to save you from the same mistake I made, that your wife is making. Sullivan stood up abruptly, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Aurora is not going to die in childbirth. Women have babies every day without dying. Some do, some don't. Are you willing to take that risk? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with 37 years of poison and pain. Sullivan had asked himself the same question every night for 9 weeks, and he still didn't have an answer that didn't terrify him. Think about it carefully, Sullivan, because if you lose her, when you lose her, you'll have the rest of your life to remember that you could have prevented it. Sullivan left his father's office feeling like he'd been hollowed out from the inside. The elevator ride down 50 floors felt like a descent into hell, each floor marking another year of his father's toxic influence, another layer of fear and doubt that had shaped him into the kind of man who could abandon his wife when she needed him most. As the city of Seattle spread out below him through the elevator's glass walls, Sullivan realized he was standing at a crossroads. He could continue down the path his father had laid out for him, a life of careful isolation and protected solitude, or he could choose to believe that love was worth the risk of loss. But as the elevator doors opened into the garage where his car waited to take him home to Aurora, Sullivan wasn't sure he was brave enough to make that choice. Dr. Elena Martinez had been practicing couples therapy for 15 years, long enough to recognize the signs of a marriage in crisis within the first 10 minutes of a session. As she watched Aurora Vane sit alone in her office, checking her phone for the third time in 5 minutes, Elena knew this case would be particularly challenging. "He's not coming," Aurora said finally, her voice carrying a mixture of disappointment and resignation that spoke volumes about the state of her marriage. "How do you feel about that?" Elena asked, settling back in her chair. At 52, she possessed the kind of calm authority that came from helping hundreds of couples navigate their darkest moments. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her warm brown eyes held genuine compassion without a trace of judgment. Aurora laughed bitterly. "I feel like I'm married to a ghost. He's physically present but emotionally absent, and I'm tired of pretending that's normal." "Tell me about when this started." "The night I told him I was pregnant." Aurora's hand moved unconsciously to her stomach, now showing the slightest curve at 10 weeks. "It was like someone flipped a switch. The man I married just disappeared." Elena made notes while Aurora talked, her professional training allowing her to read between the lines of what was being said. She'd seen this pattern before, men who retreated in the face of impending fatherhood, usually due to their own unresolved childhood trauma. But something about Aurora's description suggested deeper issues at play. "Has he given you any explanation for his behavior?" "He won't talk about anything real anymore. We discuss the weather, work schedules, household logistics, but anything connected to the baby or our future, it's like he physically can't engage." "Aurora, I have to ask, do you feel safe in your marriage?" The question seemed to surprise Aurora. "Physically? Yes, Sullivan would never hurt me that way. But emotionally," she trailed off, tears gathering in her eyes. "I feel like I'm slowly disappearing, like I'm becoming invisible in my own life." Elena nodded, recognizing the psychological damage that emotional abandonment could inflict. "What do you want to happen here? If Sullivan were sitting in this room right now, what would you need to hear from him?" Aurora was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the careful attention she brought to her nursing practice. "I would need him to tell me why he's pulling away. I would need him to fight for us instead of running from us. And I would need him to decide whether he wants to be a father and a husband, or if he wants to be alone." "And if he chooses to be alone?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Aurora straightened in her chair, and Elena saw something shift in her expression, a strength that had perhaps been there all along, but was now being called to the surface. "Then I'll choose to be strong enough for both me and this baby." Meanwhile, across the city, Sullivan sat in his office staring at a spreadsheet that might as well have been written in ancient Greek for all the sense it made to him. His ability to concentrate had deteriorated steadily over the past weeks, his legendary focus scattered by the constant noise in his head, his father's voice, Aurora's hurt expression, the sound of a heartbeat on an ultrasound he'd refused to listen to. His phone buzzed with a text from Aurora. "Session went well. Dr. Martinez has an opening Thursday if you're interested in coming." Sullivan stared at the message, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. The rational part of his brain knew he should respond, should at least acknowledge her effort to save their marriage. But the larger part of him, the part that had been shaped by 37 years of his father's influence, whispered that getting involved would only make everything worse. A knock on his office door interrupted his spiraling thoughts. Margaret entered carrying a stack of contracts, and wearing the expression she reserved for delivering unpleasant news. "Mr. Vane, there's been a situation at the Henderson Industries account." Sullivan looked up, grateful for a distraction from his personal failures. "What kind of situation?" "They're threatening to pull out of the defense contract. Apparently, there have been concerns about your reliability in recent weeks." The words hit Sullivan like a physical blow. Henderson Industries represented a $200 million contract, one of the largest deals Vane Aerospace had secured this year. More than that, Mark Henderson was supposed to be a friend, a man who'd known Sullivan for years and had never questioned his professional competence. What exactly did Henderson say? Margaret consulted her notes, clearly uncomfortable. He mentioned that you've been absent here from social functions, that Mrs. Vane seemed distressed at the last charity event. He's concerned about stability, both personal and professional. Sullivan felt his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble around him. He'd worked so hard to keep his personal struggles separate from his business life, but apparently, his efforts at compartmentalization had failed spectacularly. Schedule a meeting with Henderson tomorrow morning. Sir, I should mention, he specifically asked if everything was all right with your marriage. The words hit Sullivan like a slap. His marriage was falling apart, his business relationships were suffering, and he was sitting in his office like a coward instead of fighting for the life he'd built with Aurora. That evening, Sullivan returned home to find Aurora in the kitchen, but something was different. Instead of her usual attempt to create normalcy through domestic routine, she was packing containers of food into boxes. Her movements were efficient, purposeful, and somehow final. What are you doing? Aurora didn't look up from her packing. Making meals for Mrs. Chen next door. She just got out of the hospital after her surgery. It was such a quintessentially Aurora gesture, taking care of others, even while her own world was falling apart. Sullivan felt a sharp pang of guilt mixed with admiration for this woman who continued to be everything good and generous, while he wallowed in his own fears. That's nice of you. It's what people do for each other, when they care. The emphasis on the last sentence was subtle but unmistakable. Sullivan stood in the doorway watching his wife move around their kitchen with the same grace she'd possessed on their wedding day, when he'd thought he was the luckiest man alive. Now, he felt like he was watching her through glass, able to see her but unable to reach her. Aurora, I've been thinking, she interrupted, finally looking at him directly, about what our life is going to look like. Sullivan felt his heart begin to race. What do you mean? I mean that in less than 7 months we're going to have a baby, a tiny human being who will depend on us for everything. Food, shelter, safety, love, and I've been wondering what kind of father you're planning to be. The question was delivered without malice, but it cut deeper than any accusation could have. Sullivan had been so focused on his fear of losing Aurora that he'd barely considered the child growing inside her as a real person with real needs. Will you be the kind of father who hides in his office when things get difficult? Aurora continued. The kind who treats his family like a burden to be managed rather than a blessing to be cherished? Or will you be the kind of man who shows up when he's needed? Sullivan opened his mouth to respond, but Aurora held up her hand. Don't answer that now, because right now I don't think you know. And until you figure it out, I think we both need some space to decide what we really want. The words hit Sullivan like a physical blow. Are you leaving me? I'm staying with Meredith for a few days. To think. To figure out what I need from this marriage and whether you're capable of giving it to me. Aurora moved past him toward the stairs, presumably to pack a bag. Sullivan stood frozen in the kitchen, surrounded by the containers of food she'd prepared for their elderly neighbor, and realized that while he'd been drowning in his fears about the future, Aurora had been quietly becoming the strong, independent woman who might not need him anymore. Aurora, wait. She paused at the bottom of the stairs, her hand on the banister but didn't turn around. I love you, he said, the words feeling both insufficient and desperately important. I know you do, Aurora replied, her voice soft but sad. But love isn't enough if you're not willing to fight for it. She went upstairs, leaving Sullivan alone with the realization that for the first time in their relationship, Aurora was the one walking away, and he had no idea how to follow her. 20 minutes later, he watched her drive away in her Honda Civic, her overnight bag in the back seat, and her ultrasound photos, the ones he'd never looked at, tucked carefully in her purse. As her taillights disappeared around the corner, Sullivan understood that he'd reached the breaking point Aurora had been approaching for weeks. He could continue hiding from his fears and lose everything that mattered to him, or he could finally find the courage to face the demons that had been controlling his life since the day he was born. Standing in their empty house, surrounded by the silence that had become his constant companion, Sullivan realized that losing Aurora permanently was a far more terrifying prospect than any fear his father had planted in his mind. But realizing it and acting on it were two very different things. 3 days without Aurora felt like 3 years. Sullivan moved through their house like a man haunted, finding traces of her everywhere. Her coffee mug in the sink, her bookmark on the nightstand, the faint scent of her perfume lingering on the pillowcases. He'd never realized how much space one person could occupy until that space became an echoing void. He'd barely slept, barely eaten, and his legendary composure had cracked so visibly that even Margaret had suggested he take a few days off. The meeting with Henderson Industries had been a disaster. Sullivan's inability to focus had cost him not just the contract, but a friendship that had taken years to build. "You're not yourself, Sullivan," Mark Henderson had said, his concern genuine despite the professional disappointment. "Whatever's going on at home, you need to fix it, because this version of you isn't someone I can do business with." Now, sitting in his study at 10 o'clock on a Thursday night, Sullivan stared at his phone screen. Aurora's contact information open, but the message box empty. He'd started typing a dozen different texts over the past 3 days. Apologies, explanations, desperate pleas, but deleted them all. What could he possibly say that would explain 37 years of fear in a text message? His phone rang, startling him out of his spiraling thoughts. The caller ID showed an unknown number, but something compelled him to answer. Sullivan Vane. "Mr. Vane, this is Dr. Foster from Seattle Children's Hospital. I'm calling about your wife." Sullivan's blood turned to ice. "What happened? Is she okay?" "She's fine, sir. But she collapsed during her shift this afternoon. Dehydration and exhaustion, most likely brought on by stress. We're keeping her overnight for observation." The phone slipped from Sullivan's numb fingers, clattering onto his desk. Aurora was in the hospital, alone, because he'd been too much of a coward to fight for their marriage, and now his wife, his pregnant wife, was sick from the stress he'd caused. He was in his car within minutes, driving through the Seattle night with a desperation that bordered on reckless. The hospital corridors felt endless as he searched for Aurora's room, his heart pounding with a terror that made his previous fears seem insignificant. He found her in room 314, looking smaller than he'd ever seen her against the white hospital sheets. Her auburn hair was spread across the pillow, and even in sleep, her face showed signs of the strain she'd been carrying. An IV line ran from her arm to a bag of fluids, and monitors beeped softly in the background. "Doctor." Meredith Foster sat in the chair beside Aurora's bed, looking up when Sullivan entered. Her expression was professional but cold, the look of someone who'd seen the damage his absence had caused. "She's sleeping," Meredith said quietly. "Finally. She's been running on fumes for weeks." Sullivan approached the bed slowly, his hands trembling as he took in Aurora's pale complexion, the dark circles under her eyes that makeup had been hiding. "The baby? Fine. Aurora's strong, and 11 weeks isn't typically a high-risk period. But stress like this?" Meredith stood up, fixing Sullivan with a stare that could have cut glass. "This can't continue." "I know. Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, you've spent the past 11 weeks systematically destroying the woman who loves you, and I'm not going to watch you finish the job." The words hit Sullivan like physical blows, but he couldn't deny their truth. He'd been so consumed by his fear of losing Aurora that he'd nearly lost her anyway, through his own cruelty and neglect. "She won't talk to me. Can you blame her?" Meredith gathered her things, preparing to leave. "You know what she told me yesterday? She said she feels like she's mourning a living man, that the Sullivan she married died the night she told him about the pregnancy." Sullivan felt something crack inside his chest, a pain so sharp it was almost physical. "I never meant—" "Intentions don't matter when the result is your wife collapsing from stress." Meredith paused at the door. "She's been staying with me because she couldn't bear to be in a house where she felt like a stranger. Think about that, Sullivan. Think about what it means that your wife would rather sleep on my couch than in the bed she shares with you." After Meredith left, Sullivan sank into the chair beside Aurora's bed, finally allowing himself to really look at what his behavior had done to the woman he loved. She looked fragile in a way that scared him, not just physically, but as if something essential had been worn away by weeks of emotional abandonment. He reached for her hand, careful not to disturb the IV line, and was surprised when her fingers instinctively curled around his. Even in sleep, some part of her still reached for him. The realization broke something open in his chest that he'd been keeping carefully locked away. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking on the words. "God, Aurora, I'm so sorry." Her eyes fluttered open at the sound of his voice, confusion giving way to wariness when she saw him sitting beside her bed. "Sullivan, How did you? Dr. Foster called me. Aurora, why didn't you tell me you weren't feeling well? She studied his face in the dim hospital lighting, as if trying to read something there. When would I have told you? Between your early morning departures and your late night arrivals? Or during one of our conversations about the weather? Her words were soft but devastating in their accuracy. Sullivan felt the weight of every avoided conversation, every deflected question, every opportunity he'd had to be present, and had chosen fear instead. I know I've been absent, Aurora finished. You've been absent from our marriage, our future, our baby's life. And I'm tired, Sullivan. I'm so tired of carrying this alone. Sullivan looked down at their joined hands, her wedding ring catching the light from the hallway. 3 years ago, he'd placed that ring on her finger and promised to love her in sickness and in health, for better or for worse. He'd failed spectacularly at keeping those vows. Tell me about the baby, he said quietly. Aurora's eyes widened in surprise. What? Tell me about our baby, I want to know everything. For a moment, Aurora just stared at him, as if trying to determine whether this was another false start or a genuine change. Finally, she spoke, her voice careful but hopeful. The heartbeat is strong, 160 beats per minute at the last appointment. Dr. Chen says that's perfect. She shifted slightly in the hospital bed, her free hand moving to her stomach. I've been having morning sickness, but it's getting better. And I think I felt movement yesterday, just a flutter, but you felt the baby move? Sullivan's voice was barely above a whisper. Maybe. It's still early, but nurses learn to pay attention to their bodies. Aurora's expression softened slightly. I wanted to tell you, but you seemed so determined not to hear anything about the pregnancy. Sullivan felt tears threatening. The first tears he'd allowed himself since his mother's funeral 37 years ago. Aurora, I need to tell you something. About why I can't. You don't have to. Yes, I do. Sullivan took a shaky breath, knowing that this moment would either save his marriage or end it completely. My mother died giving birth to me, complications during delivery, and my father, he made sure I knew it was my fault. Aurora's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let go of his hand. He told me that loving someone enough to have children with them was the most dangerous thing a man could do, that bringing life into the world meant risking the life of the woman you loved most. And I believed him, Aurora. I've believed him my whole life. Sullivan, when you told me you were pregnant, all I could think about was losing you the way he lost her. I know it's irrational. I know women have babies safely every day, but the fear, it paralyzed me. Aurora was quiet for a long moment, processing his confession. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. Your father was wrong. I know that. Logically, I know that, but no buts. Aurora squeezed his hand. Your father was grieving and angry, and he took that grief out on a child who had no power to defend himself. That wasn't love, Sullivan. That was emotional abuse. The words hit Sullivan like a revelation. He'd never thought of his father's behavior as abuse, just as harsh truth delivered by a man who'd lost everything. But hearing it from Aurora's perspective, he began to see the pattern of manipulation and blame that had shaped his entire worldview. I'm afraid I'll lose you, he admitted, his voice breaking. I'm terrified that wanting this baby, loving this baby, will somehow cost me everything. Aurora shifted in the hospital bed, trying to sit up straighter despite the IV line. Sullivan, look at me. He met her eyes, seeing the strength there that had attracted him from their first meeting. I'm not your mother. This isn't 37 years ago. And our love isn't a tragedy waiting to happen. It's a blessing we get to choose every single day. Sullivan felt something shift inside him, a loosening of the tight knot of fear he'd carried since childhood. I don't know how to not be afraid. Then be afraid. But don't let fear make decisions for you. Don't let it steal our happiness before we've even had a chance to try. They sat in silence for several minutes, the soft beeping of hospital monitors providing a steady rhythm to their first real conversation in months. Sullivan felt drained but somehow lighter, as if a weight he'd been carrying had finally been shared. Aurora, I want to come to your next appointment. I want to hear the heartbeat. I want to see the ultrasound pictures. He paused, struggling with words that felt foreign but necessary. I want to be the father this baby deserves. Aurora's smile was the first genuine one he'd seen from her in weeks. The appointment is Tuesday at 2 o'clock. I'll be there. What about your father? What about the fear? Sullivan thought about Richard Vane's cold office, his calculated cruelty, the poison that had been slowly killing Sullivan's capacity for joy for 37 years. Then he looked at Aurora, brave, beautiful Aurora, who'd collapsed from stress because he'd been too cowardly to choose love over fear. My father has controlled enough of my life. He's not controlling this. Aurora leaned forward, ignoring the IV line, and kissed him softly. It was the first kiss they'd shared in weeks, and it tasted like forgiveness and possibility and the future they might still be able to build together. When they broke apart, Aurora rested her forehead against his. This doesn't fix everything, Sullivan. We still have work to do. Trust to rebuild. I know, but I want to do that work. I want to fight for us. Then fight, because I love you, but I won't disappear into your fear anymore. Our baby deserves parents who show up for each other. Sullivan nodded, understanding that this was his last chance, not just to save his marriage, but to become the kind of man who could break the cycle of fear and pain that had defined the Vane family for too long. As Aurora drifted back to sleep, her hand still holding his, Sullivan made a silent promise to the tiny life growing inside her. He would not be his father. He would not let fear win. And he would spend every day for the rest of his life proving that love was stronger than the ghosts that had haunted him for 37 years. But first, he had to survive Tuesday at 2 o'clock, his first step into a future where being a husband and father meant showing up instead of running away. Tuesday arrived with the kind of autumn rain that made Seattle feel both melancholy and hopeful. Sullivan stood outside the obstetrics clinic, his hands shaking slightly as he checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. 2 o'clock. He was early, deliberately, desperately early, because being late would confirm every doubt Aurora still harbored about his commitment to change. The past 4 days since Aurora's hospitalization had been a careful dance of rebuilding. She'd returned home Sunday evening, but to the guest bedroom, explaining that sharing a bed felt too intimate while they worked on reconstructing their foundation. Sullivan had accepted her boundaries without argument, understanding that trust, once broken, required patience to repair. He'd spent those days in unfamiliar territory, researching pregnancy, reading about fetal development, trying to educate himself about the process he'd been too afraid to acknowledge. The information was both fascinating and terrifying. At 12 weeks, their baby was approximately the size of a plum, with fully formed fingers and toes. The baby could make fists, suck its thumb, and had developed the ability to respond to external stimuli. Their child was real, not an abstract concept or a source of fear, but a tiny human being growing inside the woman he loved. Through the clinic's glass doors, Sullivan spotted Aurora in the waiting room, her auburn hair catching the fluorescent light as she filled out paperwork. She wore a soft blue sweater that complemented her complexion, and her hand rested protectively on her stomach in a gesture he'd noticed her making more frequently. The sight of her, their wife, carrying their child, sent a complex mix of emotions through him. Love, terror, determination, and something that might have been joy. He pushed through the doors and Aurora looked up at the sound. Her expression was carefully neutral, but he caught the flash of relief in her eyes when she saw him. "You came," she said softly. "I said I would. You've said a lot of things lately. The words weren't cruel, just honest. But you're here. That's what matters." Sullivan took the seat beside her, acutely aware of the other couples in the waiting room. A young pair who couldn't have been older than 22 held hands while discussing baby names. An older couple, second marriage perhaps, shared ultrasound photos with obvious joy. Everyone seemed to belong here except him. "Mrs. Vane?" A nurse appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand. "Dr. Chen is ready for you." Aurora stood and Sullivan hesitated for a moment before following. The nurse glanced at him with mild surprise, and Sullivan realized Aurora had been attending these appointments alone for months. Dr. Chen was a woman in her mid-40s, with kind eyes and an efficient manner that inspired confidence. She looked genuinely pleased to see Sullivan as they entered the examination room. "Mr. Vane, wonderful to finally meet you. Aurora speaks of you often." Sullivan felt heat rise in his cheeks, knowing Aurora had been attending these appointments alone for weeks. "Thank you for taking such good care of my wife during my absence. She makes it easy. Aurora's one of my most conscientious patients." Dr. Chen gestured for Aurora to lie back on the examination table. "How are you feeling since your hospital stay? Any lingering fatigue or nausea?" "Much better," Aurora said, though Sullivan noticed she avoided looking at him when she added, "Less stress lately, Doctor." Chen began the routine examination, checking Aurora's blood pressure and measuring her growing belly. Sullivan stood awkwardly near the door until Aurora reached out her hand. a silent invitation he accepted gratefully. "Everything looks perfect," Dr. Chen announced. "Baby's measuring right on schedule. Are you ready to hear the heartbeat?" Sullivan's mouth went dry. "The heartbeat? One of the best parts of these appointments," Dr. Chen said, applying gel to a handheld Doppler device. "Though it might take me a minute to find the right position." She placed the device on Aurora's stomach and began moving it slowly. For several seconds, there was nothing but static. Sullivan found himself holding his breath, gripping Aurora's hand perhaps tighter than necessary. Then suddenly the room filled with sound, a rapid, rhythmic whooshing that was unmistakably alive. "There we go," Dr. Chen said with satisfaction. "Strong and fast, exactly what we want to hear." Sullivan felt his knees go weak. The sound was impossible to ignore, impossible to intellectualize away. This wasn't theory or fear or abstract possibility. This was his child's heart, beating inside Aurora's body, proof of life they'd created together. "That's our baby?" His voice came out rough, barely controlled. "That's your baby," Aurora confirmed, tears streaming down her cheeks as she watched his face. For several minutes, they listened in awed silence. Chen adjusted the device occasionally, but the heartbeat remained strong and steady, a promise of the future growing between them. "Would you like to try?" Dr. Chen offered the Doppler to Sullivan. With trembling hands, Sullivan took the device and placed it where Dr. Chen indicated. When he found the heartbeat again, their baby's heartbeat, something fundamental shifted inside him. The fear didn't disappear entirely, but it was overwhelmed by something stronger. Love. "I can't believe..." He couldn't finish the sentence, too overcome by emotion. "Now for the fun part," Dr. Chen said, wheeling over an ultrasound machine. "Let's get some pictures." The ultrasound gel was cold against Aurora's skin, but she barely seemed to notice. Sullivan positioned himself where he could see the monitor clearly, his heart racing with anticipation rather than anxiety for the first time in months. The screen came to life with grainy black and white images that gradually resolved into recognizable shapes. Dr. Chen moved the wand slowly, pointing out different features as they appeared. "Here's the head, and there's the spine. Oh, perfect. Baby's moving around quite a bit today." And suddenly Sullivan could see it all. The profile of their child's face, the tiny arms and legs moving with surprising energy, the rapid flutter of the heart they'd just heard. It was the most beautiful and terrifying thing he'd ever witnessed. "Is that..." Sullivan pointed to a small protrusion on the screen. "Looks like babies sucking their thumb," Dr. Chen said with a smile. Very common at this stage. Aurora laughed through her tears, squeezing Sullivan's hand. "Our little thumb sucker. Our." The word hit Sullivan with unexpected force. Not Aurora's pregnancy or Aurora's baby, but ours. A shared responsibility and joy and future that he'd been running from for months. "Everything looks absolutely perfect," Dr. Chen concluded, printing several ultrasound photos. "Baby's growing beautifully, and Aurora's health markers are all excellent." As Dr. Chen cleaned up, Sullivan stared at the ultrasound photos in his hands. Their baby looked more human than he'd expected, more real. In one image, the baby appeared to be waving, a tiny hand raised in what could have been greeting or farewell. "Next appointment is in 4 weeks, Dr. Chen said, handing Aurora a card. "We'll do another ultrasound then, and if you want to know the baby's sex, we should be able to tell." After the appointment, Sullivan and Aurora sat in his car in the clinic parking lot. The ultrasound photos spread between them like a bridge across the chasm his fear had created. "Thank you for coming," Aurora said quietly. "Thank you for letting me." They drove home in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the appointment and what it meant for their future. Sullivan kept glancing at the ultrasound photos on the dashboard, still struggling to process the reality of what he'd seen and heard. At home, Aurora made tea while Sullivan studied the photos at the kitchen table. Every detail fascinated him. The perfect curve of the baby's spine, the miniature feet, the face that somehow already looked like it belonged to both of them. "I've been thinking about names," Aurora said, setting a mug in front of him. "Names? I know we haven't talked about any of this, but I couldn't help myself." She pulled a small notebook from her purse, pages filled with her neat handwriting. "I made lists. Traditional names, modern names, family names." Sullivan looked at the lists, seeing names he'd never considered having relevance to his life. "What about family names?" "Well, Sullivan is obviously a family name for you, and Aurora was my grandmother's name." She paused, studying his face. "What was your mother's name?" Sullivan felt the familiar tightness in his chest at the mention of his mother, but for the first time, it was accompanied by curiosity rather than just pain. Catherine Elizabeth. That's beautiful. Catherine Elizabeth Vane has a lovely sound. If it's a girl. And if it's a boy? Sullivan thought about it, realizing he'd never allowed himself to imagine having a son. I don't know. Not Richard. Aurora reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. We have time to figure it out, all of it. That evening, Sullivan found himself in his study, but instead of burying himself in work as he had for months, he was researching cribs and car seats and everything else he'd refused to think about. Aurora appeared in the doorway around 9 o'clock, wearing the pajamas that made her look younger than her 32 years. What are you doing? Learning, Sullivan said, gesturing to his computer screen filled with baby gear reviews. Apparently choosing a car seat is more complicated than negotiating aerospace contracts. Aurora smiled, the first completely unguarded smile he'd seen from her since her pregnancy announcement. It's overwhelming at first, but we don't need to figure everything out tonight. I want to, though. I want to be prepared. He struggled for the right words. I want to be the partner you deserve, the father our baby deserves. Sullivan, you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be present. Present. Such a simple word, but it encompassed everything he'd failed to be for the past 3 months. Sullivan stood up from his desk and walked to where Aurora stood in the doorway. I love you, he said, the words carrying more weight than they ever had before. And I love our baby. I'm sorry it took me so long to say that. Aurora's eyes filled with tears, but they were happy tears this time. I love you too, both of you. They stood there for a moment, not quite touching but closer than they'd been in months, surrounded by the quiet comfort of their home and the promise of the family they were building together. But as Sullivan reached for Aurora's hand, his phone rang. The caller ID showed his father's number, and Sullivan felt his stomach clench with familiar dread. Richard Vane had an uncanny ability to intrude at the worst possible moments. Don't answer it, Aurora said, reading his expression. I have to. He'll keep calling. Sullivan picked up the phone, his voice carefully controlled. Hello, Dad? Sullivan, I heard you were at the hospital the other day. Is Aurora all right? The question caught Sullivan off guard. His father rarely inquired about Aurora's well-being, and never with what sounded like genuine concern. She's fine. Just some dehydration. Good. There was a pause. Then Richard's voice took on its familiar, calculating tone. I also heard you accompanied her to a doctor's appointment today. Sullivan felt Aurora tense beside him. Somehow his father had already learned about their visit to Dr. Chen. That's right. I think we need to talk. Tomorrow morning. My office. Dad, I'm not. 10 o'clock, Sullivan. Don't be late. The line went dead, leaving Sullivan staring at his phone with a growing sense of dread. His father's summons felt ominous, like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon of his newfound happiness. What did he want? Aurora asked, though her expression suggested she already suspected. To talk. About today, probably. About the baby. Aurora's face went pale. What are you going to tell him? Sullivan looked at the ultrasound photos still scattered on his desk, then at Aurora standing in the doorway with her hand protectively covering their child, and felt something crystallize inside him. He'd made his choice in the clinic today. Now he had to defend it. The truth, that I'm going to be a father, and he has no say in how I handle that. But even as he said the words, Sullivan felt the familiar chill of his father's influence creeping back into his thoughts. Richard Vane had controlled his son's fears for 37 years. And one afternoon of ultrasounds and heartbeats might not be enough to break that hold completely. Tomorrow's conversation would determine whether Sullivan could finally break free from his father's poison, or whether Richard would find a way to drag him back into the darkness just when he'd begun to see the light. Sullivan stood outside his father's office at exactly 10 o'clock Wednesday morning, the ultrasound photos from yesterday's appointment tucked safely in his jacket pocket. He'd looked at them a dozen times since leaving home, each glance strengthening his resolve. Whatever psychological warfare Richard Vane had planned, Sullivan was no longer the broken boy who'd spent 37 years accepting blame for his mother's death. He's waiting for you, Richard's assistant said, her tone suggesting she pitied anyone about to enter the lion's den. Richard sat behind his imposing desk, but this time Sullivan noticed details he'd overlooked before. The office was sterile, devoid of personal photographs or mementos. No pictures of Sullivan's mother, no family memories, nothing that suggested Richard Vane had ever cared about anything beyond corporate success and maintaining control. Sit down, Sullivan. I'll stand. Richard's eyebrows rose slightly at this deviation from their usual dynamic. For 37 years, Sullivan had been the obedient son, accepting his father's pronouncements without question. The shift in power was subtle, but unmistakable. As you wish. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying Sullivan with calculating eyes. I understand congratulations are in order. You're going to be a father. That's right. And you've decided to embrace this development, despite everything I've taught you about the risks involved. Sullivan felt the familiar tightness in his chest, but this time he recognized it for what it was. Not truth, but conditioning. Years of carefully planted fears designed to keep him isolated and under Richard's influence. What you taught me was wrong. The words hung in the air between them, a direct challenge that Richard had never faced from his son. For a moment, something flickered across the older man's face. Surprise, perhaps, or anger quickly suppressed. Was it? Tell me, Sullivan. What happens if Aurora doesn't survive the birth? That's not going to happen. How can you be so certain? Do you think love makes you immune to tragedy? Do you think wanting something badly enough guarantees it will turn out well? Richard stood up, moving to the wall of windows that showcased Seattle's skyline. Your mother wanted you more than anything in the world. She planned for you, prepared for you, loved you before you were even born. And it killed her. Sullivan felt the old pain trying to resurface, but this time he had armor against it. Aurora's love, their baby's heartbeat, the knowledge that he was no longer alone with these poisonous thoughts. My mother died from complications that had nothing to do with wanting a baby. She died from a medical emergency that could have happened to anyone. She died because she chose to have a child, because she prioritized your existence over her own survival. She died because sometimes terrible things happen, and no amount of fear or isolation can prevent them. Richard turned back to face him, and Sullivan saw something he'd never noticed before. Not grief or protective love, but something darker, something that looked like satisfaction at having successfully planted his poison in Sullivan's mind for so many years. You're making a mistake, son. A mistake that will cost you everything you care about. The only mistake I made was listening to you for 37 years. Sullivan pulled the ultrasound photos from his pocket, setting them on Richard's desk. This is my child, Aurora's and mine, and I'm going to love this baby, and I'm going to be the kind of father who shows up, who supports, who doesn't poison their child's mind with fear and blame. Richard glanced at the photos with what looked like disgust. Sentimental nonsense. Love isn't sentimental nonsense. It's the only thing that matters. Love is what killed your mother. No, Sullivan said, his voice growing stronger with each word. What killed my mother was a medical tragedy. What's been killing me for 37 years is you. The accusation seemed to strike Richard like a physical blow. For the first time in Sullivan's memory, his father looked genuinely shocked. You don't know what you're talking about, don't I? You've spent my entire life making sure I felt responsible for her death, making sure I was too afraid to love anyone the way you claim you loved her. And why? Because if I was happy, if I built a family, if I moved on with my life, it might prove that tragedy doesn't have to define everything that comes after. Sullivan stepped closer to his father's desk, feeling decades of suppressed anger finally finding its voice. You didn't keep me isolated to protect me, Dad. You kept me isolated to protect yourself, because as long as I was as miserable and afraid as you are, you didn't have to face the possibility that you could have chosen differently, that you could have honored her memory by living fully, instead of by making sure her son never got the chance to be happy. Richard's face had gone pale, but his voice remained controlled. You have no idea what loss feels like, Sullivan. When you lose Aurora and you will lose her, then you'll understand why I tried to spare you this pain. If something happens to Aurora, I'll grieve. I'll be devastated. But I'll still be grateful for every day we had together, every moment of love we shared, every second of our baby's life. Because that's what you do when you really love someone. You celebrate the time you have instead of destroying it with fear about the time you might lose. Sullivan picked up the ultrasound photos, no longer willing to leave them in his father's presence. I'm done taking your calls about my personal life, Dad. I'm done letting you poison my marriage with your fears. And I'm especially done letting you anywhere near my child. Sullivan? Goodbye, Dad. Sullivan walked toward the door, feeling lighter with each step. Behind him, he heard his father's voice, sharp with desperation he'd never heard before. When she dies in that delivery room, don't come to me for comfort. Don't expect sympathy from the man you just accused of ruining your life. Sullivan paused at the door, turning back to see Richard Vane looking smaller somehow, diminished by his own bitterness. When our baby is born healthy and Aurora recovers beautifully, I won't expect an apology either, because by then, I hope to be too busy being happy to care what you think about it. The elevator ride down 50 floors felt like a journey through time, past 37 years of fear and guilt and careful emotional distance, toward a future where love was stronger than the ghosts that had haunted the Vane family for too long. By the time Sullivan reached the lobby, his phone was already buzzing with text messages from Aurora. How did it go? Are you okay? Come home when you're ready. I love you. Sullivan smiled as he typed his response. On my way. I have something to tell you. The drive home through Seattle traffic gave Sullivan time to process what had just happened. For the first time in his adult life, he'd stood up to Richard Vane completely, not just disagreed with him or deflected his criticisms, but actively rejected his worldview and chosen a different path. He found Aurora in the nursery, a room they'd been using for storage, but which she'd apparently spent the morning clearing out. Boxes were neatly stacked in the hallway, and she was standing in the center of the empty space, her hands on her hips, surveying the possibilities. You've been busy, Sullivan said from the doorway. Aurora turned, her face anxious as she searched his expression. How was it? With your father? It was... Sullivan searched for the right words. Final. What do you mean? Sullivan entered the room, imagining it filled with the furniture and decorations their child would need. A crib by the window where morning light would wake their baby gently. A rocking chair where Aurora could nurse while he read bedtime stories. A changing table covered with soft blankets and tiny clothes. I told him the truth, about what his poison has done to me, about how I'm choosing to live my life going forward, about how he'll never be allowed to treat our child the way he treated me. Aurora's eyes filled with tears. What did he say? Exactly what you'd expect. That I'm making a mistake, that you're going to die, that I'll regret choosing love over fear. Sullivan pulled out his phone and showed her a text that had arrived during his drive home. And then this. Aurora read the message aloud. Vane Aerospace board meeting called for Friday morning. Recommendation to remove Sullivan Vane as CEO due to personal instability affecting company performance. He's trying to destroy your career. He's trying to control me the only way he has left. Sullivan took Aurora's hands in his, noticing how her wedding ring caught the light streaming through the nursery window. But I don't care anymore. We have enough money saved to live comfortably for years. I can start my own company, or we can move somewhere completely different. What matters is us. Aurora stared at him as if seeing him clearly for the first time in months. You'd give up everything you've built? I've already given up everything that matters by being afraid to fight for it. My career, my father's approval, the company, none of that means anything if I lose you and our baby, because I was too much of a coward to choose happiness. Aurora stepped closer to him, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her body, close enough to see the hope and love and determination in her eyes. What if we don't have to choose? What if we fight for both our family and your career? How? Aurora smiled, the expression transforming her face from pretty to radiant. By showing everyone that the man who stood up to his father this morning is exactly the kind of leader Vane Aerospace needs. By proving that personal growth makes you stronger, not weaker. By refusing to let him define the narrative. Sullivan felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Excitement about the future instead of fear. You want to take on Richard Vane? I want to take him on with you. As a team. As partners. As two people who refuse to let fear win. They stood together in the empty nursery, surrounded by possibilities and hope and the growing certainty that their love was strong enough to overcome whatever challenges lay ahead. Sullivan could almost see their future taking shape in this room. Late-night feedings and first smiles, and the 1,000 tiny moments that would make up their child's early life. There's something else, Sullivan said, remembering the other text message that had arrived during his drive home. Mark Henderson called. He wants to schedule a meeting to discuss the contract. The one you lost because of everything. Apparently, word is spreading about my confrontation with my father. Some people are interpreting it as strength rather than instability. Aurora laughed, the sound bright and hopeful in the afternoon sunlight. Maybe standing up for your family is exactly the kind of leadership people want to see. Maybe it is. Sullivan's phone buzzed again, this time with a call from an unknown number. He hesitated before answering, still sensitive to unexpected communications after his father's psychological warfare. Sullivan Vane. Mr. Vane, this is Rebecca Martinez from Seattle Business Journal. I'm calling about reports of some significant changes at Vane Aerospace. Would you be available for an interview? Sullivan looked at Aurora, who nodded encouragingly. If they were going to fight for their future, they might as well start now. I'd be happy to speak with you, Ms. Martinez, but I should mention that any interview would need to include my wife. This story isn't just about business, it's about family. Aurora's smile could have powered the entire city. As Sullivan scheduled the interview for later that afternoon, he realized that for the first time in months, he was looking forward to tomorrow. Not just surviving it, not just getting through it, but actually excited about what it might bring. But in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered that Richard Vane had never lost a fight without taking his opponent down with him, and Friday's board meeting was still 3 days away. The Seattle Business Journal interview took place in Sullivan and Aurora's living room, the warm afternoon light creating the kind of intimate setting that television producers dream about. Rebecca Martinez, a sharp-eyed journalist in her early 40s, had arrived with a photographer who was currently capturing candid shots of the couple on their couch, Aurora's hand resting on her visible bump at 16 weeks, Sullivan's arm around her shoulders in a gesture that spoke of genuine partnership. "So, Mr. Vane," Rebecca said, consulting her notes, "there are rumors that your father called an emergency board meeting to question your fitness as CEO. Can you comment on that?" Sullivan felt Aurora's hand squeeze his, a silent reminder that they were in this together. "It's true that my father has called a board meeting for Friday morning. As for questioning my fitness to lead, I think recent events have actually demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership Vane Aerospace needs. Can you elaborate on that?" Sullivan had spent the past 2 days preparing for this moment, but sitting here with Aurora beside him, the words came naturally rather than from a script. "For too many years, I made business decisions based on fear rather than vision. I avoided risks, maintained the status quo, and led from a place of protection rather than innovation." He paused, looking at Aurora. "My personal growth over the past few weeks, learning to choose love over fear, family over isolation, has made me a better leader, not a worse one." Rebecca leaned forward, clearly sensing a deeper story. "This personal growth you mention, it's connected to your wife's pregnancy?" Aurora spoke up, her voice calm and confident. "My husband has spent most of his adult life carrying trauma that wasn't his to bear. Becoming a father has forced him to confront that trauma and choose a different path, not just for our family, but for the people who work for him and depend on his leadership. Mrs. Vane, you're a pediatric nurse at Seattle Children's Hospital. How has your husband's transformation affected your view of his professional capabilities?" Aurora smiled, the expression reaching her eyes in a way that made Sullivan fall in love with her all over again. "The man who can acknowledge his fears, work to overcome them, and choose to fight for his family is exactly the kind of person I'd want leading a company. He's not the same person who used to make decisions from a place of emotional distance. He's engaged, present, and willing to take risks for the right reasons." The photographer captured that moment. Aurora's confident smile, Sullivan's obvious admiration for his wife, the sense of two people who had fought for their relationship, and one, Mr. Vane. "There are reports that several clients have expressed concerns about your recent personal challenges. How do you respond to that?" "I respond by pointing to our track record," Sullivan said, his voice gaining strength. "Vane Aerospace has grown by 30% over the past 3 years. We've secured contracts with NASA, the Defense Department, and private aerospace companies around the world. My personal struggles didn't diminish those achievements. They were accomplished despite my emotional limitations. Imagine what we can achieve now that those limitations are being addressed." Rebecca made notes, clearly impressed by the narrative taking shape. "And your father? Richard Vane built this company from nothing. How do you reconcile your vision with his legacy?" This was the question Sullivan had been dreading and preparing for in equal measure. He felt Aurora's hand tighten on his, a reminder that truth was their strongest weapon. "My father is a brilliant businessman who built something extraordinary from nothing. I respect that achievement immensely." Sullivan paused, choosing his words carefully. "But building a company and leading it into the future require different skills. My father's approach was perfect for the challenges he faced. The challenges I face, and the opportunities ahead of us, require a different kind of leadership." "What kind of leadership is that?" "Leadership that values collaboration over control. Leadership that sees emotional intelligence as a strength, not a weakness. Leadership that understands that the best business decisions come from a place of vision and hope, not fear and protection." After the journalists left, Sullivan and Aurora spent the evening preparing for Friday's board meeting. The dining room table was covered with financial reports, client testimonials, and strategic plans that Sullivan had been developing for months, but had never had the confidence to present. "This projection for the civilian space tourism division is incredible," Aurora said, studying the documents with the same attention she brought to her patients' medical charts. "Why haven't you proposed this before?" "Because it's risky. Because it requires significant investment with no guaranteed return. Because my father would have said it was reckless and irresponsible. And now?" Sullivan looked at the plans. Bold, innovative ideas that could position Vane Aerospace as a leader in the next generation of space exploration. "Now I think it's exactly the kind of vision that will keep us competitive for the next 50 years. Aurora leaned back in her chair, one hand absently rubbing her growing belly. At 13 weeks pregnant, she was finally beginning to show, and the sight filled Sullivan with wonder rather than fear. "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think you're going to win on Friday. Not because you're fighting against your father, but because you're finally fighting for something bigger than fear." That night, Sullivan lay awake in their bed. Aurora had moved back into their bedroom earlier in the week, declaring that separate rooms were no longer necessary, listening to her steady breathing and feeling something he hadn't experienced in months, genuine excitement about the future. But his phone buzzed at 2:17 a.m. with a text from an unknown number. "Check your email. A friend." Sullivan slipped out of bed and went to his study, his stomach churning with familiar anxiety. The email was from an anonymous account, but the message was clear enough. "Thought you should know what your father has planned for Friday's meeting. See attachments." Sullivan opened the first attachment and felt his blood turn to ice. It was a medical file, Aurora's medical file from her recent hospitalization, including notes about stress-related complications and concerns about her marriage affecting her health. The second attachment was worse. A psychological evaluation report that Sullivan had never seen before, supposedly documenting his emotional instability and inability to handle personal stress without professional deterioration. The third attachment made Sullivan's hands shake. A proposed restructuring plan that would remove him as CEO and install Richard as interim leadership, with provisions to sell major divisions of the company to competitors. His father wasn't just trying to remove him from leadership, he was planning to destroy everything Sullivan had built and sell the pieces to the highest bidder. Sullivan's phone rang, the caller ID showing his father's number. "I see you got my message." Richard's voice was calm, almost pleasant. "You had someone steal Aurora's medical records?" "I had someone research the facts that will be presented to the board on Friday. Aurora's hospitalization, your inability to maintain professional relationships, your recent emotional outbursts, it all paints a picture of a man who cannot be trusted with a billion-dollar company. This is illegal. Accessing private medical records is perfectly legal when it's done through proper channels by licensed investigators concerned about corporate leadership stability." Richard's voice took on its familiar patronizing tone. "I tried to warn you, Sullivan. I tried to save you from this path, but you insisted on choosing emotional sentiment over rational business decisions." Sullivan felt rage building in his chest, but it was clean anger now, uncomplicated by guilt or self-doubt. "You're not protecting the company, Dad. You're trying to destroy it rather than let me prove you wrong. I'm preventing a disaster. When Aurora dies in childbirth, and she will die, Sullivan, because that's what happens when vain men fall in love, you'll be completely incapacitated. The company will collapse. Thousands of jobs will be lost, and decades of work will be destroyed. I'm simply accelerating the inevitable. Aurora isn't going to die. Your mother was younger and healthier than Aurora. She had the best medical care available, and she still died because bearing children is dangerous and love makes people take dangerous risks." Sullivan felt something crystallize in his mind, a clarity that cut through 37 years of fear and manipulation. "You know what I think, Dad? I think you're not afraid Aurora will die in childbirth. I think you're afraid she won't. Because if she survives, if our baby is born healthy, if I succeed at both fatherhood and running the company, then it proves that your entire worldview is wrong. It proves that you could have chosen differently after Mom died, that you could have honored her memory by living fully instead of by making everyone around you miserable." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. "Friday morning, Sullivan. 10 o'clock. Come prepared to defend yourself because I certainly am." The line went dead, leaving Sullivan alone in his study with the evidence of his father's betrayal spread across his computer screen. But for the first time since this battle began, Sullivan felt like he was holding the stronger hand, because Richard Vane had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated what a man would do to protect his family. Friday morning arrived gray and cold, Seattle's typical November weather matching the mood in Vane Aerospace's boardroom. Sullivan sat at the conference table 30 minutes early, his presentation materials organized, and his resolve stronger than it had ever been. Aurora had wanted to come for moral support, but he'd convinced her that this particular battle was one he needed to fight alone. The board members filed in one by one, 12 individuals who had worked with both Sullivan and his father for years, their faces carefully neutral, but their body language suggesting they knew this meeting would determine the company's future. Richard Vane entered last, his silver hair perfectly styled, his charcoal suit impeccable, every inch the distinguished businessman who had built an empire from nothing. He took his seat at the head of the table with the confidence of a man who had never lost a fight. "Thank you all for coming," Richard began, his voice carrying the authority that had intimidated Sullivan for 37 years. "We're here to discuss a matter of critical importance to the future of Vane Aerospace, the fitness of our current CEO to continue in his leadership role." Sullivan felt his phone buzz with a text from Aurora. "I love you. Show them who you really are." As his father began presenting the case against him, Sullivan realized that this moment had been inevitable since the day Aurora told him she was pregnant. All the fear, all the running, all the careful emotional distance, it had all been leading to this confrontation between the man he'd been and the man he was choosing to become. Richard Vane had spent 40 years building his empire on a foundation of fear and control. Sullivan was about to find out if love and courage were strong enough to tear that foundation down. The boardroom at Vane Aerospace had witnessed countless corporate battles over the years, but none quite like this. 12 of the most influential business leaders in Seattle sat around the polished mahogany table, their faces carefully composed as they prepared to watch a father attempt to destroy his son's career, or a son finally claim his rightful place as leader. Richard Vane stood at the head of the table, a stack of documents before him like weapons in an arsenal he'd been building for weeks. His presentation had been methodical and damning. Sullivan's recent absences from work, his erratic behavior during client meetings, the collapse of several key relationships, and most damaging of all, Aurora's hospitalization due to stress-related complications. "The evidence is clear," Richard concluded, his voice carrying the weight of decades of corporate authority. "My son is experiencing a personal crisis that has fundamentally compromised his ability to lead this company. His judgment is impaired, his priorities are confused, and his emotional instability poses a direct threat to our shareholders, our employees, and our clients." Sullivan had listened to the presentation without interruption, feeling remarkably calm despite the character assassination taking place before his eyes. 3 months ago, these accusations would have destroyed him. Today, they felt like echoes of a fear that no longer had power over him. "Thank you, Richard," said Margaret Foster, the board's senior member and a woman Sullivan had known since childhood. "Sullivan, you'll have equal time to respond to these concerns." Sullivan stood up, his movements deliberate and confident. He'd prepared extensively for this moment, but as he looked around the table at faces he'd known for years, he realized that his response needed to come from the heart rather than from a script. "Ladies and gentlemen, my father is absolutely right about one thing. I have been going through a personal crisis, but he's wrong about what that crisis means for my ability to lead this company." Sullivan moved away from the table, addressing the board members directly rather than hiding behind formal presentation materials. 3 months ago, my wife told me she was pregnant. Instead of celebrating, I panicked. Instead of supporting her, I withdrew. Instead of embracing the future we were building together, I allowed fear to control every aspect of my life." He paused, meeting each board member's eyes. "Fear that had been planted in my mind when I was too young to question it. Fear that has shaped my decision-making for 37 years. Margaret Foster leaned forward slightly. "What kind of fear, Sullivan?" "The fear that loving someone enough to build a family with them would inevitably lead to tragedy. The fear that taking emotional risks would compromise my professional judgment. The fear that showing vulnerability would make me unfit to lead." Sullivan turned to face his father, seeing something flicker across Richard's features. Surprise, perhaps, that his son was being so direct about family secrets. "My father taught me that love was weakness, that emotional investment was dangerous, that the safest way to live was to keep everyone at arm's length and never allow personal feelings to influence professional decisions." Sullivan's voice grew stronger, and for years, that philosophy seemed to work. I was successful, focused, completely in control. But, prompted James Harrison, the board's financial expert, but I was also hollow. My successes felt empty because I had no one to share them with. My vision for the company was limited because it came from a place of protection rather than possibility. And my leadership was constrained because I was so afraid of making mistakes that I rarely took the kinds of risks that drive real innovation. Sullivan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, opening the video Aurora had helped him prepare the night before. "I'd like to show you something." The wall-mounted screen came to life with images of Vane Aerospace's facilities, employees, and achievements over the past 3 years. But these weren't the usual corporate promotional materials. These were candid shots of real people doing remarkable work, narrated by Sullivan's voice explaining his vision for the company's future. "The aerospace industry is changing rapidly," Sullivan's recorded voice explained as images of cutting-edge technology filled the screen. "Companies that cling to old models, old fears, old limitations will be left behind. The future belongs to organizations willing to take calculated risks, embrace innovation, and build teams based on trust rather than control." The video showcased Sullivan's plans for civilian space tourism, sustainable rocket technology, and partnerships with international space agencies, projects he'd been developing for months but had been too afraid to propose because they represented significant departures from Richard's conservative approach. "These initiatives represent a billion-dollar opportunity," the recorded Sullivan continued, "but they require leadership that's willing to bet on possibility rather than hide from risk. They require emotional intelligence to build the partnerships necessary for success. And they require the kind of vision that can only come from someone who understands that the greatest achievements in human history have always been driven by love. Love of discovery, love of progress, love of the future we're building for our children." When the video ended, the boardroom was silent. Sullivan could see several members taking notes, their expressions thoughtful rather than skeptical. "The past 3 months have been the most challenging of my life," Sullivan continued, his voice now carrying the confidence of a man who had faced his demons and won. "But they've also been the most transformative. Learning to be a husband who shows up for his wife, preparing to be a father who will be present for his child. These experiences haven't made me weaker as a leader. They've made me stronger, more focused, and more capable of inspiring the kind of loyalty and innovation this company needs to thrive." Richard Vane stood up abruptly. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. Emotional manipulation, sentimental appeals to—" "Dad," Sullivan's voice cut across his father's objection with quiet authority. "You've had your time to speak. Now it's mine." The shift in power was subtle but unmistakable. For the first time in 37 years, Sullivan had told his father to be quiet, and Richard had actually stopped talking. "I want to address the specific concerns that have been raised," Sullivan said, turning back to the board. "Yes, I missed several client meetings during my wife's health crisis. Yes, I was distracted and unfocused during a difficult period in my marriage. Yes, I made mistakes." He paused, letting that acknowledgement sink in. "But I also learned from those mistakes. I sought help when I needed it. I fought to save my marriage instead of abandoning it. And I ultimately chose to face my problems rather than run from them." Sullivan's voice grew stronger. "Those aren't the actions of a man who lacks judgment. Those are the actions of a leader who understands that real strength comes from the ability to grow, adapt, and choose courage over fear." Margaret Foster glanced around the table, reading the mood of her fellow board members. "Sullivan, these proposals you've outlined, they're impressive, but they're also quite different from the conservative approach that's made this company successful. How do we know you're not overcompensating for your father's caution by swinging too far in the opposite direction?" It was a fair question, and Sullivan had expected it. "Because I'm not rejecting everything my father built. I'm building on it. The foundation he created, the financial stability, the reputation for quality, the relationships with key clients, those achievements give us the freedom to take calculated risks. But foundation isn't the same thing as limitation." Sullivan moved to the window, looking out at the Seattle skyline where other aerospace companies were already working on the innovations he'd outlined in his presentation. "The choice isn't between my father's approach and my approach. The choice is between a company that continues to grow and evolve and a company that becomes so afraid of change that it gets left behind by competitors who aren't paralyzed by the fear of making mistakes." Richard Vane had remained silent during Sullivan's presentation, But now he stood up again, his face pale with controlled anger. You want to talk about mistakes? Let's talk about what happens when this pregnancy ends in tragedy. Let's talk about how you'll function as a leader when you're dealing with the kind of loss that destroys everything you think you know about life. The words hung in the air like a curse, and Sullivan felt every person in the room tense at the cruelty of the attack. But instead of feeling the familiar knife twist of fear, Sullivan felt something else. Pity for a man so consumed by his own pain that he couldn't imagine any other outcome. Dad, I'm sorry you lost Mom. I'm sorry you've spent 37 years believing that loving her was a mistake instead of a blessing. And I'm sorry you've convinced yourself that the only way to honor her memory is by making sure her son never gets to experience the kind of happiness you shared with her. Sullivan turned back to the board, his voice steady and clear. But I refuse to live my life as a monument to fear. My mother wanted a child. She chose to have a family. And the greatest tribute I can pay to her memory is to choose love over the fear that's been poisoning our family for nearly 4 decades. Margaret Foster looked around the table one more time, then stood up. I think we've heard enough from both parties. The board will need time to deliberate. She was interrupted by Sullivan's phone ringing. He glanced at the screen and saw Aurora's number, which surprised him. She knew how important this meeting was and wouldn't interrupt unless something was wrong. I'm sorry, Sullivan said, but I need to take this call. Sullivan? Aurora's voice was tight with pain. Something's wrong. I'm bleeding and I can't. Oh God, it hurts. The phone slipped from Sullivan's hands as pure terror crashed over him. Aurora was in trouble. Their baby was in trouble. And he was 30 minutes away from the hospital, trapped in a boardroom while his world potentially fell apart. I have to go, Sullivan said, his voice breaking as he grabbed his jacket. My wife, the baby. He was halfway to the door when Richard's voice stopped him cold. And there it is. The moment when personal crisis destroys professional responsibility. This is exactly what I've been warning you about. Sullivan turned back to his father, and for a moment the boardroom seemed to fade away, until it was just the two of them, facing each other across 37 years of fear and pain. You're right, Dad. This is exactly what you warned me about. The moment when the person you love most needs you, and you have to choose between being there for them or protecting yourself from potential pain. Sullivan's voice was steady despite the terror flooding his system. The difference is, I'm choosing love. He looked around the table one last time. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry to leave this meeting unfinished, but my wife is in the hospital, possibly losing our baby, and there is absolutely nothing in this building that matters more than being with her right now. Sullivan headed for the door, then paused one final time. If that disqualifies me from leading this company, then so be it. But I'd rather lose my career than lose my family. And I'd rather make that choice honestly than spend the rest of my life wondering if I was too much of a coward to fight for what really matters. As Sullivan raced from the boardroom toward the elevator, he could hear Margaret Foster's voice behind him. I think we have our answer about what kind of leader Sullivan Vane really is. But Sullivan was already gone, his mind focused on only one thing, getting to Aurora before it was too late. Sullivan's hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel, weaving through Seattle traffic with a desperation that bordered on reckless. His phone was on speaker, Aurora's labored breathing filling the car as Dr. Meredith Foster tried to keep her calm while they waited for the ambulance. The bleeding's getting worse, Aurora gasped. Meredith, I can't lose this baby. I can't. You're not going to lose anything, Sullivan said, his voice breaking as he ran a red light. I'm almost there. Just hold on. Sir, you need to slow down, came a different voice, the EMT who had arrived at their house. We're getting her stabilized. Sullivan pulled into the hospital parking garage just as the ambulance arrived at the emergency bay. The next hour passed in a blur of medical terminology, urgent consultations, and the kind of fear that made his previous anxieties seem insignificant. Aurora was 15 weeks pregnant, past the point where most miscarriages occurred but still weeks away from viability. As Sullivan paced the hospital corridor, he realized that everything his father had predicted was coming true. The woman he loved was in danger. Their baby might not survive, and he was completely powerless to fix any of it. Dr. Chen emerged from Aurora's room, her expression carefully professional. Mr. Vane, we need to talk. Sullivan's blood turned to ice. The baby's heart rate is strong, which is encouraging, but Aurora has placental abruption. The placenta is separating from the uterine wall prematurely. We've managed to stop the bleeding for now, but Dr. Chen led him to a quiet corner of the hallway. The next few hours are critical. If the bleeding starts again, we may need to deliver the baby immediately to save Aurora's life. Sullivan felt the world tilt around him. At 15 weeks, immediate delivery would mean losing their child. But waiting could mean losing Aurora. What are the odds? With placental abruption at this stage, honestly, it's about 50-50 for both of them. Sullivan sank into a nearby chair, his father's voice echoing in his mind. When Aurora dies in childbirth, and she will die, Sullivan, you'll understand why I tried to spare you this pain. For a moment, the fear threatened to overwhelm him completely. This was why his father had spent 37 years in emotional isolation. This was why loving someone enough to build a family was so dangerous. This was why, Mr. Vane, Dr. Chen's voice brought him back to the present. Would you like to see your wife? Sullivan looked up, seeing concern in the doctor's eyes. Is she? She's conscious and asking for you. Mr. Vane, whatever happens over the next few hours, Aurora needs to feel your strength, not your fear. Sullivan found Aurora propped up in a hospital bed, looking pale but alert. An IV line ran from her arm, and monitors tracked both her vital signs and their baby's heartbeat. The sound that had filled him with such joy just weeks ago now seemed fragile, precarious. How did the board meeting go? Aurora asked as he approached her bed. Sullivan almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. Are you seriously asking about work right now? I'm asking about our future. Did you show them who you really are? Sullivan took her hand, careful not to disturb the medical equipment. I walked out when you called, left them sitting there while I ran to be with you. Good. Good? Aurora, I probably lost everything. My job, the company, the respect of everyone in that room. You chose us, Aurora said softly. You chose love over fear. That's what good fathers do, Sullivan. They show up when their family needs them. Before Sullivan could respond, Aurora's face contorted in pain. The monitors began beeping urgently and nurses rushed into the room as fresh blood stained the hospital sheets. Get Dr. Chen, one of the nurses called. Now. The next few minutes were chaos. Medical staff moving with practiced efficiency while Sullivan was pushed to the side, helpless to do anything but watch as his wife and child fought for their lives. Dr. Chen arrived within seconds, quickly assessing the situation. We need to get her to surgery now. Surgery? Sullivan's voice was barely a whisper. Emergency C-section. The bleeding's too severe to wait. But the baby, at 17 weeks. Mr. Vane, if we don't operate immediately, we'll lose them both. They wheeled Aurora toward the operating room, Sullivan walking alongside her gurney. She was conscious but weak, her face pale against the white sheets. Whatever happens, Aurora said, gripping his hand with surprising strength, I want you to know that loving you, building this life with you, was worth every risk. You're going to be fine, Sullivan said, his voice breaking. Both of you are going to be fine. And if we're not? Sullivan felt everything his father had taught him about love and loss and the dangers of emotional investment crash over him like a wave. But then he looked into Aurora's eyes. Brave, beautiful Aurora who had fought for their marriage when he'd given up, who had believed in their love when he'd lost faith, and he knew what he had to say. If we're not, then I'll grieve. I'll be broken. But I'll also be grateful for every moment we had together, every laugh, every fight, every ordinary Tuesday night when you made dinner and complained about your day at the hospital. Because loving you has been the best thing I've ever done, even if it turns out to be the most painful. Aurora smiled through her tears. Now you sound like the man I married. They reached the operating room doors, where Sullivan would have to let go of her hand and wait. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, tasting salt and fear and the lingering scent of her shampoo. I love you, he whispered. Come back to me. I love you too. Both of you. The doors swung closed, leaving Sullivan alone in the corridor with nothing to do but pace and pray, and confront the possibility that his father's prophecies were about to come true. His phone buzzed with a text from Margaret Foster. Board voted unanimously. You're still CEO. Some things matter more than business meetings. Under normal circumstances, the message would have filled him with relief and vindication. Today, it barely registered. The only thing that mattered was on the other side of those operating room doors. Sullivan called his father. I assume you're calling to tell me I was right. Richard's voice was cold, clinical. Aurora's in surgery, emergency C-section. They might not make it. For a moment, there was silence on the other end of the line. Then, I'm sorry, Sullivan. I truly am. Are you? Or are you relieved that your predictions are coming true? You think I wanted this? I think you've been so invested in being right about the dangers of love that you forgot to hope you were wrong. Sullivan heard his father take a shaky breath. When your mother died, I wanted to die too. The only thing that kept me going was making sure you understood how dangerous love could be. I thought if I could protect you from that kind of pain, you thought you were saving me. But Dad, the pain you were trying to protect me from? I've been living with it for 37 years anyway. You just made sure I was too afraid to experience the joy that makes that risk worthwhile. And if Aurora doesn't survive? If you lose them both? Sullivan looked through the operating room windows where he could see medical staff working frantically to save his family. Then I'll grieve, but I won't regret loving them. I won't spend the rest of my life bitter and afraid. And I won't pass that poison on to anyone else. 2 hours later, Dr. Chen emerged from the operating room still in surgical scrubs. Her expression was carefully neutral, giving nothing away. Mr. Vane? Sullivan's heart stopped. Are they? Your wife is stable. The surgery was successful. We were able to stop the bleeding and repair the placental separation. She's going to be fine. Sullivan felt his knees go weak with relief. And the baby? Doctor? Chen smiled. The first genuinely happy expression he'd seen from her all day. Your son is in the NICU. He's small, obviously, but his lungs are developing well and his vital signs are strong. It's going to be a long road, probably 2 to 3 months in the hospital. But babies born at this stage have excellent survival rates with proper care. My son? Your son. Would you like to meet him? The NICU was a maze of incubators and monitors. Premature babies fighting their first battles surrounded by the most advanced medical technology available. Dr. Chen led Sullivan to an incubator near the window, where the smallest human being he'd ever seen lay connected to tubes and wires that looked impossibly large for his tiny body. He weighs just over a pound, Dr. Chen explained, but he's breathing on his own, which is remarkable for his gestational age. Sullivan stared at his son, trying to reconcile this fragile little fighter with the abstract concept of baby he'd been so afraid to embrace. The tiny fingers moved slightly, and Sullivan found himself speaking without conscious thought. Hi there, he whispered. I'm your dad. I'm sorry it took me so long to be excited to meet you. As if responding to his voice, the baby's eyes opened slightly. Just a flutter, but definitely purposeful. He can hear you, Dr. Chen said softly. Premature babies often respond well to their parents' voices. Sullivan stayed by the incubator for an hour, talking to his son about everything and nothing. Their house with its wraparound porch, the nursery Aurora had started preparing, the aerospace projects he was working on that would help build a better world for the next generation. When he finally went to see Aurora, she was awake but groggy from the anesthesia. How's our baby? Perfect, Sullivan said, meaning it completely. Small but perfect. And he has your chin. Aurora laughed, then winced at the pain from her incision. What are we going to call him? Sullivan had been thinking about that question during his vigil in the NICU. What do you think about James, after your grandfather? James Vane. Aurora considered it, then smiled. I like it. James Sullivan Vane. Perfect. They sat together in comfortable silence, both exhausted but filled with the kind of joy that comes after surviving the worst fear imaginable. Sullivan's phone buzzed with messages, from board members, from clients, from friends who had heard about Aurora's emergency, but he ignored them all. I was so scared, Aurora said finally. So was I, more scared than I've ever been in my life. But you stayed. You chose to be here instead of protecting yourself from the possibility of loss. Sullivan took her hand, thinking about his father sitting alone in his sterile office, surrounded by the success he'd built, but isolated from any real connection or joy. I finally figured out what my mother would have wanted, Sullivan said. Not for her son to spend his life afraid of loving someone the way his father loved her. She would have wanted me to honor her memory by choosing love over fear, by building the family she died bringing into the world. Aurora squeezed his hand. She would have loved James. She would have loved you. 3 days later, Sullivan stood in his father's office for what he knew would be the last time. Richard looked older somehow, diminished by the weight of his own bitterness and the knowledge that his son had chosen a different path. The baby survived, Richard said. It wasn't a question. James is doing well. Aurora's recovering beautifully. We'll all be going home in a few weeks. Richard nodded, staring out the window at the Seattle skyline. I suppose you think this proves I was wrong. I think it proves that love is always a risk worth taking. Sullivan placed a letter on his father's desk, his formal resignation from Vane Aerospace effective immediately. What's this? I'm starting my own company. With the innovations I presented to the board, I've already secured funding from 3 different investment groups. Several of our best engineers are coming with me. Richard's face went pale. You're destroying everything I built. I'm building something new, something based on vision instead of fear, collaboration instead of control. Sullivan turned toward the door, then paused. You're welcome to be part of James's life, Dad, but only if you can figure out how to choose love over the need to be right about everything. As Sullivan left his father's office for the final time, he felt lighter than he had in years. The man who had once controlled every aspect of his life through fear and manipulation now seemed small, irrelevant, powerless to affect the future Sullivan was building with Aurora and their son. That evening, Sullivan sat in the NICU, reading to James from a book about aerospace engineering while Aurora dozed in the chair beside him. Their son had gained weight every day since his birth, surprising the doctors with his resilience and determination. You know what I think? Sullivan said softly to his sleeping son. I think you're going to be the kind of person who chooses courage over comfort, love over safety, possibility over protection. And I promise you that your mother and I will be there to support you every step of the way. As if responding to his father's voice, James opened his eyes and seemed to focus on Sullivan's face for the first time. In that moment, their son looking at him with trust and recognition, Sullivan understood that he'd finally become the man Aurora had always believed he could be, the man his mother had died hoping he would become, the man who chose love over fear, no matter what the cost. 2 years later, the sound of toddler laughter filled the wraparound porch of the Victorian house in Queen Anne, where a 2-year-old James Vane was chasing soap bubbles with the determined focus that had characterized him since his dramatic entrance into the world. At nearly 3 feet tall and 30 pounds of pure energy, he showed no signs of his premature birth except perhaps an extra dose of the resilience that had helped him survive those first critical months in the NICU. Daddy, more bubbles, James demanded, his dark hair, so like Sullivan's, curling at the edges from the Seattle summer humidity. His eyes were Aurora's hazel, bright with curiosity and mischief. Sullivan sat on the porch steps, the bubble solution balanced on his knee, while he watched his son with the kind of wonder that still caught him off guard sometimes. 2 years of fatherhood had transformed him in ways he couldn't have imagined during those dark months when fear had ruled his life. Okay, buddy, but then it's nap time, Sullivan said, dipping the bubble wand and creating a stream of iridescent spheres that caught the afternoon sunlight. James squealed with delight and launched himself after the bubbles, his coordination still adorably imperfect but his enthusiasm unlimited. Watching him, Sullivan remembered the tiny fighter in the NICU incubator, connected to machines that seemed impossibly large for his fragile body. The doctors had warned them about potential developmental delays, respiratory issues, a dozen complications that might arise from his early arrival. Instead, James had thrived. He'd walked at 13 months, said his first word, Mama, at 10 months, and had been sleeping through the night since he came home from the hospital. He was smart, healthy, and possessed a stubborn determination that Aurora claimed he'd inherited from both sides of the family. How's my favorite engineer? Aurora's voice came from the front door, where she stood wearing scrubs from her shift at the hospital, and carrying the kind of tired smile that meant she'd had a good day helping other people's children. He's designing a new bubble-catching system, Sullivan said, standing to kiss his wife hello. Very innovative approach involving running in circles and giggling. Aurora laughed, settling beside Sullivan on the steps to watch their son's bubble pursuit. At 34, she was even more beautiful than she'd been on their wedding day, her face showing the confidence and contentment of a woman who had fought for her happiness and won. How was work? Sullivan asked, noting the slight exhaustion around her eyes. Busy, good busy. We had a little girl come in today who reminded me so much of James when he was tiny. Same fighting spirit. Aurora leaned against Sullivan's shoulder. How was your day? Productive. The NASA contract came through officially. Vane Industries will be designing the propulsion system for the new Mars mission. That's incredible. Aurora turned to face him fully, her eyes bright with pride. Sullivan, do you realize what this means? You're literally helping humanity reach for the stars. Sullivan felt a familiar surge of satisfaction, not just for the professional achievement, but for the way Aurora celebrated his successes as if they were her own victories too. Starting his own company 2 years ago had been terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, but having Aurora's unwavering support had made all the difference. Vane Industries now employed 43 people, had secured contracts with NASA, SpaceX, and 3 international space agencies, and was developing technology that could revolutionize space exploration. More importantly, it was a company built on collaboration rather than control, innovation rather than fear, and the kind of visionary thinking that had been impossible when Sullivan was trying to manage his father's expectations instead of following his own instincts. "Daddy!" James had abandoned the bubbles and was climbing the porch steps with the determined expression he wore when he had something important to communicate. "Story time? After your nap, little man." "Story now?" James tried his most persuasive smile, the one that usually worked on Aurora but had less success with Sullivan's engineering precision about schedules. "Nice try, buddy. Nap first, then story time." James considered this negotiation seriously, then nodded with the dignity of someone who understood the value of delayed gratification. "Okay, Daddy, but the story about the rocket?" "Absolutely, the story about the rocket." Aurora scooped James up, laughing when he immediately cuddled against her shoulder with the complete trust that children reserve for parents who have proven themselves reliable. "Come on, little astronaut, let's get you settled down." As Aurora carried James inside for his nap, Sullivan remained on the porch steps, looking out at the neighborhood where they'd built their life together. The house next door belonged to Dr. Meredith Foster and her wife Sarah, who had become like family over the past 2 years. Mrs. Chen still lived on the other side, though her recovery from surgery had been slower than Aurora's post-C-section healing. Sullivan's phone buzzed with a text message. The sender's name made him pause. Richard Vane. "Saw the news about the NASA contract. Congratulations." It was the first communication Sullivan had received from his father in 6 months, since the last awkward attempt at a relationship that had ended with Richard criticizing James's lack of discipline and Aurora's permissive parenting style. Sullivan considered responding, then decided against it. Some bridges burned beyond repair, and the peace he'd found was too valuable to risk for the sake of a relationship that had never brought him anything but pain. Aurora returned to the porch 20 minutes later, having changed out of her scrubs into jeans and one of Sullivan's old college t-shirts that had somehow migrated permanently into her wardrobe. "He's out cold," she reported, settling back onto the steps beside Sullivan. "Started telling me about the rocket story before his eyes even closed. He's obsessed with space travel lately. Wonder where he gets that from," Aurora said with mock seriousness. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching their neighborhood come to life around them. Children playing in front yards, neighbors walking dogs. The ordinary magic of a summer evening in Seattle. "I have something to tell you," Aurora said eventually, her voice carrying a note that made Sullivan turn to look at her directly. "Good something or concerning something?" "Good something. Very good something." Aurora smiled, reaching for his hand. "I'm pregnant." For a moment Sullivan felt an echo of the old fear, the automatic anxiety that had consumed him when Aurora first shared this news 2 years ago. But it lasted only seconds before being overwhelmed by pure joy. "Really?" "Really. 8 weeks. I wanted to be sure before I told you." Sullivan felt tears he hadn't expected gathering in his eyes. "How do you feel?" "Excited, happy, a little nervous about managing 2 kids under 3, but mostly just grateful that we get to do this again." Sullivan kissed her, tasting salt and happiness and the promise of another chapter in the life they were building together. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said, the words carrying all the weight of everything they'd survived and everything they were building together. "I love you too, all of you." As if summoned by their conversation, James appeared in the doorway, his hair messed from sleep and his favorite stuffed rocket tucked under his arm. "No more nap," he announced with the authority of someone who had decided the rest period was officially over. "Did you have a good sleep, sweetheart?" Aurora asked, opening her arms to accept the cuddles that James freely dispensed after naps. "Dream about flying," James said, settling between his parents on the porch steps. "Flying to the moon. Maybe someday you will fly to the moon," Sullivan said, ruffling his son's hair. "Would you like that?" James considered this possibility seriously. "With Mommy and Daddy?" "With whoever you want, buddy." "And baby brother?" Sullivan and Aurora exchanged glances over James's head. They hadn't told him about the pregnancy yet, and they hadn't even discussed whether they wanted to know the baby's sex this time. "How do you know about a baby brother?" Aurora asked carefully. James shrugged with the casual wisdom of toddlers everywhere. "Just know. Mommy's tummy has baby. Like before I was born. Aurora laughed, shaking her head at their son's intuitive grasp of family dynamics. Well, there might be a baby. We'll have to wait and see. Baby brother, James said with certainty, then brightened. Story time now? Story time now, Sullivan agreed. As the three of them settled on the porch swing that Aurora had insisted they needed for moments exactly like this, Sullivan felt the kind of contentment he'd never believed possible during those months when fear had ruled his decisions. James curled up between his parents, clutching his rocket while Sullivan told the story of brave astronauts who explored distant planets and discovered that the most important thing they could bring on their adventures was love for the people waiting for them back home. The story was improvised, probably scientifically inaccurate and definitely sentimental, but James listened with rapt attention, occasionally asking questions about rocket fuel or alien civilizations, with the seriousness of someone who fully expected to encounter these challenges personally someday. As the Seattle sun began to set behind the Olympic Mountains, painting their porch in golden light, Sullivan realized that this moment, sitting with his family, telling stories about space exploration while Aurora's hand rested protectively over their second child, was everything his mother had died hoping he would have. The fear that had controlled him for 37 years seemed like something from another lifetime, a story about a different man who had been too afraid to reach for happiness. That man had missed the first 3 months of James's life, had nearly lost Aurora through his own cowardice, had spent years building walls instead of bridges. This man, the one telling rocket stories on a front porch while his pregnant wife laughed at his dramatic sound effects and his son planned future space missions, this man had learned to choose love over fear every single day. "Daddy," James said as the story wound down, "when I go to space, will you help me build my rocket?" "Absolutely, buddy. We'll build the best rocket anyone's ever seen. And Mommy can come too? If Mommy wants to come, we'll make sure there's room for her. And baby brother? And baby brother too." James nodded with satisfaction, apparently having resolved all the important logistical details for his future career as an astronaut. He yawned, the combination of afternoon adventures and story time finally catching up with him. "Time for real bedtime, little man," Aurora said, scooping him up from the swing. As Aurora carried James inside to begin the bedtime routine, Sullivan remained on the porch, watching the first stars become visible in the darkening sky. His phone buzzed again, probably work emails or messages from friends, but he ignored it. This moment, this feeling of complete peace and gratitude, was too precious to interrupt with the outside world. Aurora returned 20 minutes later, settling back onto the swing beside him. "He wants you to come say goodnight," she said. "Something about making sure you explain the rocket story to his stuffed animals." Sullivan laughed, standing to go fulfill his fatherly duties. "Did I mention I love our life? Only about a dozen times today, but I never get tired of hearing it." After saying goodnight to James and providing the requested rocket story summary to an audience of stuffed animals, Sullivan found Aurora in their bedroom, already changed into the soft pajamas that made her look younger than her 34 years. She was sitting on their bed, holding an ultrasound photo that she must have gotten at her appointment earlier that week. "I was waiting for the right moment to show you this," she said, handing him the small black and white image. Sullivan studied the photo, seeing the familiar bean-shaped form that looked so much like James's first ultrasound pictures, but this baby looked more developed, more clearly human in its details. "Everything looks perfect," Aurora said. "Dr. Chen says based on the measurements, the due date is April 15th. A spring baby. A spring baby who will have a big brother to teach them about rockets and space exploration." Sullivan set the ultrasound photo on his nightstand, next to the first picture of James that he'd carried in his wallet for 2 years. "Are you hoping for a boy or a girl this time?" "I'm hoping for healthy. Everything else is just bonus." Sullivan settled onto the bed beside Aurora, pulling her close enough that he could feel the slight curve of her belly where their second child was growing. "I can't believe we get to do this again." "Scared?" "A little. But it's good scared, excited scared, not the kind of paralyzing fear that used to control everything I did." Aurora turned in his arms so she could look at him directly. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't fought through that fear? If you'd let it win?" Sullivan considered the question seriously. 2 years ago, he might have deflected or changed the subject. Now he was comfortable examining even the painful possibilities. "I think I would have lost you. I think I would have become exactly like my father, isolated, bitter. surrounded by professional success but completely empty of anything that actually matters. He paused, running his fingers through Aurora's hair. And I think I would have missed out on knowing James, on watching him grow into this incredible little person who sees wonder in everything. Do you think your father will ever understand what he missed? I don't know, I hope so for his sake, but I can't control his choices anymore. I can only control mine. They lay in comfortable silence for a while, Aurora's head on Sullivan's shoulder while he traced patterns on her arm, and thought about the future they were building together. James would be an amazing big brother. Their new baby would grow up in a house filled with love and laughter, and bedtime stories about space exploration. Aurora would continue saving children's lives at the hospital, while he designed technology to help humanity reach for the stars. It wasn't a perfect life. No life ever was. There would be challenges ahead, sleepless nights with a newborn, the chaos of managing 2 young children, the ordinary struggles that all families faced. But they would face those challenges together, as partners who had already proven they could survive anything as long as they chose love over fear. Aurora, thank you. For what? For fighting for us when I was too afraid to fight for myself. For believing in the man I could become when I couldn't see past the man I was. For giving me James and now this new baby, and the chance to break all the patterns that have defined my family for too long. Aurora lifted her head to look at him, her eyes bright with emotion. You fought too, Sullivan. You chose to change when it would have been easier to stay afraid. You chose us when it meant giving up everything you thought defined you. Best decision I ever made. Second best, Aurora corrected with a smile. What was the first best? Marrying me in the first place. Sullivan laughed, pulling her closer. You're right. Marrying you was the first best decision. Everything good in my life started with that choice. As they settled into sleep, Aurora's hand on her growing belly and Sullivan's arm around them both, he thought about the rocket story he'd told James earlier. About brave explorers who traveled to distant worlds but always remembered that the most important thing was the love waiting for them back home. He'd spent most of his adult life afraid that love was dangerous, that caring too much would inevitably lead to devastating loss. Now he understood that love wasn't the danger, it was the destination. It was the reason for taking risks, for reaching beyond comfort zones, for choosing courage over fear every single day. Tomorrow he would wake up in this house with this woman and their son, with another child on the way and a company that was literally helping humanity reach for the stars. He would have conversations about rocket fuel over breakfast and bedtime stories about space exploration after dinner. He would continue building a life that honored his mother's memory, not through fear and isolation, but through joy and connection, and the kind of love that makes everything worthwhile. And if his father ever decided to choose love over the need to be right about everything, there would be room for him in this life too. But if not, Sullivan was finally at peace with that choice as well. Some people spent their entire lives controlled by fear, and there was nothing he could do to save someone who didn't want to be saved. The only life he could control was his own, and he was choosing love every single day for the rest of his life. 2 years later, Sullivan Vane had discovered that his father was wrong about everything that mattered. Love didn't make you weak. It made you brave enough to fight for what was worth protecting. Building a family wasn't dangerous. It was the greatest adventure possible. And choosing happiness over fear wasn't reckless. It was the most rational decision he'd ever made. As he drifted off to sleep beside the woman who had saved him from his own worst instincts, with their son dreaming about rocket ships in the next room, and their second child growing safely in Aurora's womb, Sullivan finally understood what his mother had died hoping he would learn, that love is always worth the risk and the only tragedy is being too afraid to try. What decision would you have made in Sullivan's place? Would you have chosen love over fear, even knowing the risks involved? Your participation means a lot to the channel. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.